Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the servants' entrance of a grand Victorian house where the air smells of lye soap and yesterday's roast. And you're about to discover a hidden world most people never see. You stand in a dim corridor, your hands already raw from dawn scrubbing, watching women in starched aprons move with military precision through their morning routines. Above your head, the family still sleeps in featherbeds, but down here in the basement kingdom, an entire female universe operates according to rules as rigid as any corporation, as complex as any royal court. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why your great-grandmother never spoke about her years in service, or why certain old houses have those strange back staircases. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or what drew you to this particular journey into the past. Maybe you have your own family stories about domestic service. Or perhaps you're just curious about how half the population once lived and worked in shadows. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You wake at 4:30 in the morning, though wake isn't quite accurate. You never really slept deeply enough to call it waking. The attic room you share with two other girls stays cold enough that your breath makes clouds, and the single blanket does almost nothing against the draft sneaking through roof tiles. Your feet hit bare floorboards, and you fumble in darkness for the uniform folded at the foot of your narrow bed. The dress is coarse cotton, dyed a brown so deep it's nearly black, designed to hide the dirt you'll accumulate over the next 18 hours. You're a scullery maid, which means you occupy the absolute bottom of a ladder you're only beginning to understand exists. Down 3 flights of servant stairs, steep, narrow, designed to keep you invisible, you enter the scullery, a stone-floored room that stays perpetually damp. The copper pots from last night's dinner are stacked like a mountain, each one crusted with grease and burnt residue. Your hands plunge into water so cold it makes your joints ache, and you begin scrubbing with sand and soap, your knuckles turning red, then purple. This is your kingdom, this windowless room where you'll spend most of your waking hours. Above you, in the main kitchen, the cook is already barking orders at the kitchen maids, her voice carrying through the stone walls like thunder. Further up still, on the ground floor, a housekeeper glides through silent rooms checking for dust with white-gloved fingers, and higher yet, in the family quarters, a lady's maid lays out her mistress's clothes with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. You don't see most of these women yet, but you feel their presence, the weight of that authority pressing down through floorboards and ceilings. The household operates like a living organism, and you're just one cell in a complex body. In the 1880s, when domestic service reached its absolute peak in Britain, roughly 1 in 3 women between the ages of 15 and 25 worked in someone else's home. Think about that for a moment. Imagine every third young woman you know, scrubbing someone else's floors, emptying someone else's chamber pots, wearing someone else's cast-off shoes. This wasn't unusual. This was simply life. In the United States, the numbers were similar, especially in urban areas where wealthy families competed to display their status through the number of servants they employed. The hierarchy you're entering has roots stretching back centuries, but it crystallized into its most elaborate form during the Victorian era, when the expanding middle class desperately wanted to mimic aristocratic lifestyles. A family that could afford even one maid suddenly joined a different social category, and families with 5 or more servants could consider themselves genuinely respectable. The system created a pyramid with you, the scullery maid at the base, and somewhere near the top, though still technically a servant, the housekeeper who probably earns more in a month than you'll see in a year. by 6 o'clock, you're supposed to have the copper pots gleaming and the kitchen floor scrubbed. The cook arrives and barely glances at you. You're beneath her notice, literally and figuratively. She's a formidable woman in her 40s who rules the kitchen like a general commanding troops, and she didn't get to her position by being kind to the likes of you. The kitchen maids appear next. 2 girls who might be only a year or 2 older than you, but who treat you with the casual cruelty of those who have someone beneath them to kick. They hand you more dishes, more pots, and occasionally mutter about how slow you are, how clumsy, how they could do your job with their eyes closed. Historians still argue whether the domestic service hierarchy was more oppressive or more liberating than factory work. The main alternative for working-class women in the factories, you'd earn slightly better wages and have your evenings free, but you'd also face dangerous machinery, lung-destroying air, and the constant risk of injury with no compensation. In service, you had a roof over your head, meals provided, and theoretically some protection from the outside world's harshest elements. But you also surrendered almost every aspect of personal autonomy. You ate what you were given, slept where you were told, worked the hours dictated by the household's needs, and submitted to rules governing everything from your hairstyle to whether you could receive male visitors. Here's a quirky detail most people never learn. In many grand houses, upper servants and lower servants ate separately, in different rooms, at different times, and often ate different quality food. The housekeeper, butler, and lady's maid might dine on the family's leftovers, roast beef and decent wine, while you in the scullery gnawed on bread and dripping with weak tea. Even among servants, class divisions reproduced themselves in miniature. The upper servants sometimes insisted on being called Mr. or Miss by lower servants, maintaining the same formal distance that the family maintained with all of you. Your first week in service is a blur of exhaustion and humiliation. You break a pot, just a small crack, really, and the cook docks your wages before you've earned any. You spill water on the kitchen floor and one of the kitchen maids slips. She boxes your ears hard enough to make them ring for hours. You learn to move silently, to anticipate needs before they're spoken, to read moods in the set of shoulders and the tone of sighs. You learn that asking questions marks you as stupid, but failing to understand unspoken expectations marks you as lazy. The tightrope you walk has no safety net, and below it lies dismissal without references, which means no other respectable house will hire you, which means the street, the workhouse, or worse. Yet even here, at the bottom, you sense the possibility of movement. The second kitchen maid whispers to you one night that she started exactly where you are now, and that if you keep your head down and work hard enough, maybe in 2 or 3 years you could advance. 2 or 3 years of freezing water and aching hands and 4:30 mornings. 2 or 3 years of being invisible, being nobody, being less than human to the people walking the floors above your head. But then, and this is the seductive promise the system offers, you might become somebody. You might get to boss around the next desperate girl who arrives with nothing but her labour to sell. You've been in the house 6 months now, and you're finally beginning to understand the invisible map that governs everyone's movements. The hierarchy isn't written down anywhere. No one hands you a manual explaining who ranks above whom, but you feel it in every interaction. Every order given, every cold shoulder turned, is like learning a language without a dictionary, where a single wrong word can mean disaster. The structure is so ingrained that even the newest servant somehow absorbs it within weeks, understanding instinctively who can be questioned and who must be obeyed without hesitation. At the very bottom, where you still crouch scrubbing in the scullery, exists a cluster of the truly powerless: scullery maids, boot boys, hall boys, and sometimes a tweenie, a girl caught between roles, not quite advanced but no longer the absolute lowest. You see the boot boy sometimes, A thin child of maybe 12 who spends his days polishing the family's shoes until his fingernails are permanently blackened. He's male, which in the outside world might grant him certain advantages. But here in the basement, gender means nothing when you're at the bottom, the tweenie, a girl named Sarah who sometimes helps in both the kitchen and the upper rooms, occupies an especially miserable position. She answers to everyone, belongs to no one, and gets blamed when anything goes wrong in either realm. One step up from your tier are the kitchen maids, usually 2 or 3 in a grand house. They actually prepare food under the cook's direction, chopping vegetables, making pastries, stirring sauces. The work is still brutal and the hours equally long, but they're learning actual skills, and they're visible to the cook in a way you're not. The first kitchen maid, especially, wields real power in her domain. She can make your life easier by occasionally letting you warm yourself by the stove. Or she can make it hell by reporting every tiny mistake to the cook. You've learned to stay on her good side, which means volunteering for her least favourite tasks and never, ever complaining. The cook herself occupies a position of genuine authority. In a large household, she might oversee 4 or 5 people, control a substantial monthly budget for provisions, and make decisions that directly affect the family's comfort and health. A talented cook could command impressive wages. In the 1890s, an experienced cook in a wealthy London household might earn £40 to £50 per year, which doesn't sound like much until you realise you're making perhaps £8 to £10. The cook doesn't wear a servant's uniform like you do. She wears regular dark dresses with an apron, and she has her own sitting room where she plans menus and meets with tradesmen. Some cooks, particularly those in aristocratic households, achieve near celebrity status, with their signatures dishes becoming famous across social circles. Then there's the laundry maid, whom you rarely see because she works in a separate building or basement room that stays perpetually hot and steamy. Her world revolves around enormous copper vats of boiling water, lye soap that burns the skin, and the back-breaking work of washing bed linens, tablecloths, and the family's endless wardrobe. Historians still argue whether laundry work was worse than scullery work. Both destroyed your hands and aged you prematurely. But at least the laundry maid wasn't under the cook's constant surveillance. The laundry room was its own isolated kingdom, and a skilled laundress who could remove stains and handle delicate laces was genuinely valued, even if she was never truly respected. Moving up the ladder, you reach the housemaids, usually ranked as under housemaid, second housemaid, and head housemaid. These women maintain the family's living spaces, which means they work on the ground and upper floors, servant territory. Yes, but closer to the family's world than you'll ever get in the scullery. They rise even earlier than you do, creeping into reception rooms to light fires before the family wakes, so that when aristocratic feet hit aristocratic carpets, the rooms are already warm. They dust, sweep, polish, and arrange everything according to strict standards. A head housemaid in a fine house might supervise 3 or 4 girls, inspect their work with a critical eye worthy of a military commander, and report directly to the housekeeper. Here's something most people don't realise. The different types of maids often never spoke to each other, even when living in the same house. You, in your scullery, might work for years without having a real conversation with a housemaid. They use different staircases, ate at different times, and move through different spaces. The invisible walls between servant categories were sometimes as rigid as the walls between servants and family. A housemaid who tried to be friendly with you might be reprimanded for lowering herself, and if you dared speak to her without being spoken to first, you'd be accused of presumption above the housemaids, occupying increasingly rarefied air. Come the specialists, the lady's maid, the governess, and the housekeeper. These are the aristocrats of the servant world, and the distance between you and them is almost as vast as the distance between you and the actual aristocracy. The lady's maid attends to the mistress of the house personally, dressing her, styling her hair, maintaining her wardrobe, and often accompanying her when she travels. A good lady's maid needed skills that took years to develop. She had to understand fashion, be able to style hair in elaborate arrangements, remove stains from silk and satin, make invisible repairs to damaged garments, and most importantly, keep every secret she encountered. She might earn £30 to £40 a year, plus cast-off clothing that was often quite valuable. And she enjoyed privileges like a private bedroom and the use of her mistress's bathroom. The governess occupies the strangest position in the entire hierarchy, neither servant nor family, floating in a liminal space that drove many women to despair. She's educated, sometimes well-bred, often from a family that fell on hard times. She teaches the children, takes meals with them in the nursery, and maintains the standards of a gentlewoman. But she's paid wages, dismissed at will, and excluded from both the servants' hall and the family dining room. Other servants often resented governesses for putting on airs, while the family treated them as useful but ultimately disposable employees. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre captured this painful in-between existence perfectly, and the novel resonated with thousands of women who recognised their own lonely predicament in its pages. And then, at the peak of the female servant hierarchy, reigns the housekeeper. In your 6 months of service, and you've seen her perhaps 3 times, always from a distance. She glides rather than walks, her keys hanging from a chatelaine at her waist, jingling softly with each step, the sound of absolute authority. She's usually an older woman, always addressed as Mrs., even if she's never married, is an honorary title conveying respect. And she controls everything from the household accounts to the servants' conduct, to the storage of valuable items. In the grandest houses, the housekeeper managed dozens of people, maintained inventories worth thousands of pounds, and wielded power that some middle-class men would envy. What's fascinating is how women enforce this hierarchy on other women, often with more rigidity than any male employer would bother with. The housekeeper who rose from scullery maid herself might be the harshest taskmaster, determined to maintain the standards she suffered under, or perhaps proving that she transcended her origins. Female solidarity, the idea that women would naturally support each other, simply didn't exist in this world. Your enemies weren't the abstract forces of capitalism or patriarchy. Your enemies were often the cook who worked you until you collapsed, the head housemaid who reported your mistakes, the housekeeper who dismissed girls for the slightest infractions. Yet the system's genius lay in making advancement seem possible, if distant. Every woman above you had theoretically started somewhere below, and if you were exceptionally skilled, exceptionally lucky, and exceptionally willing to sacrifice everything else in your life, you too might climb a few rungs. The scullery maid could become a kitchen maid, the kitchen maid could become a cook, the under housemaid could become a head housemaid. It rarely happened. Of course, most women spent decades at the same level, or left service entirely for marriage or factory work, but the possibility glimmered just enough to keep you scrubbing these pots with something resembling hope. You've been watching the second kitchen maid, Alice, for months now, studying her movements the way a soldier studies terrain. She's only 17 but carries herself with the confidence of someone who's escaped the scullery and has no intention of ever returning. You want what she has? The ability to actually cook instead of just cleaning up after cooking. The slightly better dress. The way the cook sometimes asks her opinion instead of just barking orders. But the path from where you stand to where she stands is far murkier than you initially imagined, paved with unspoken tests and deliberate obstacles placed by the very people who supposedly want competent staff. Promotion in domestic service isn't like advancement in modern workplaces, where you might apply for a position, interview, and receive a clear yes or no. Instead, you're perpetually auditioning, performing unpaid labour beyond your station in the hope that someone notices and rewards you. When Alice calls in sick for 2 days with a fever, you volunteer to take on her vegetable preparation duties in addition to your scullery work. You arrive at 4 in the morning instead of 4:30, stay until 10 at night instead of 9, and somehow manage both roles without sleeping. The cook doesn't thank you. She merely grunts acknowledgement that the carrots are adequately diced. But you've demonstrated capability, which is the first requirement for moving up. The second requirement is survival, outlasting the other desperate girls competing for the same advancement. There are 3 scullery maids now, after a new girl arrived last month, fresh from the countryside and even more clueless than you were. The unspoken rule is that only one of you will eventually move up. The others will either remain stuck or leave service entirely. This creates a poisonous atmosphere where cooperation becomes betrayal of your own interests. When you discover a faster way to scrub the copper pots, you don't share the technique with the other scullery maids. When one of them makes a mistake, you don't cover for her, you let the cook discover it, because her failure makes your competence shine brighter by comparison. Here's something nobody tells you about before you enter service. The women above you have a vested interest in keeping you down. Alice doesn't want you to become a kitchen maid because that makes you her competitor for the next level up. The first kitchen maid actively sabotages teaching opportunities because she's terrified of being replaced by someone younger and cheaper. Even the cook, who theoretically should want skilled assistants, sometimes withholds knowledge because her authority depends on being indispensable. You're surrounded by women who climbed the ladder by stepping on others, and they assume you'll do the same to them if given the chance. They're absolutely right, of course, which is the tragedy of the whole system. Skill development happens through theft and observation rather than formal training. You lurk near the kitchen table when you're supposed to be in the scullery, watching how Alice kneads bread dough, noting the exact moment she adds the sugar to the yeast mixture. You listen to the cook explaining pie crust to the first kitchen maid, memorising the ratio of lard to flour even though no one's speaking to you. Late at night, when everyone else is asleep, you practice knife skills on vegetable scraps salvaged from the compost, training your hands to move with the speed and precision you've observed in others. Everything you learn is stolen knowledge acquired through espionage in your own workplace. Then comes the inspection culture, which permeates every household and makes advancement feel like walking through a minefield. The cook inspects your scullery work daily, running her finger along pot rims looking for grease. The housekeeper conducts weekly tours of the entire house, checking everything from the temperature of the linen closet to the shine on the brass doorknobs. And occasionally, the mistress herself descends from the upper floors to examine servants and their domains with an eye for imperfections. One speck of tarnish on a pot, one smudge on a floor tile, one moment of less than perfect posture, and you're marked as careless, lazy, unsuitable for advancement. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with domestic perfection was about genuine cleanliness or about displaying control over an increasingly chaotic industrial world. Middle-class families who couldn't control factory closures or stock market crashes could at least control whether their servants' uniforms had crisp white collars. The inspections weren't really about hygiene. They were about power, about creating a space where anyone felt in command. And you, scrubbing at 4:30 in the morning, are the visible proof of that control. The rules you must master go far beyond cleaning techniques. You learn that you're never supposed to speak unless spoken to, never supposed to be seen in the main house if avoidable, never supposed to make eye contact with family members. You practice walking silently, developing a gliding motion that keeps your footsteps from echoing on stone floors. You train yourself to become furniture, present when needed, invisible when not. Upper servants perfect this even more thoroughly. A truly skilled lady's maid could dress her mistress while being so unobtrusive that the mistress might later forget she was there. Here's a quirky detail. Many houses had elaborate systems of bells connected to different rooms, each with a distinctive sound, so servants could identify which room was calling without leaving the basement. Learning the bell code was essential for advancement. A housemaid who couldn't instantly distinguish between the drawing room bell and the morning room bell would never become head housemaid. Some grand houses had bellboards with 20 or more bells, creating a musical language of demands and summons. You had to respond immediately, whatever you were doing, even if you were in the middle of eating the one meal you'd get all day. After 18 months in the scullery, your hands are permanently damaged. The skin is thick and cracked, with scars from burns and cuts that never quite healed properly. You're 16 years old and your hands look 50. But you've also mastered every aspect of scullery work and taken on increasing kitchen duties whenever opportunities arise. You can joint a chicken, make a basic white sauce, and identify by smell when something's beginning to burn. These skills were never formally taught. You acquired them like a language learned by immersion, through watching and practicing and failing when no one was looking. Then one morning, Alice announces she's leaving. She's found a position in another household that will pay her £8 more per year. The cook doesn't seem surprised. Turnover is constant in service, with women leaving for better positions, for marriage, or simply because they can't bear it anymore. For 3 days. No one mentions who will fill Alice's role. You continue doing scullery work while also handling some kitchen duties, demonstrating that you can manage both. The first kitchen maid watches you with undisguised hostility. She wanted to bring in someone she already knows, someone who will be loyal to her rather than a potential threat. On the 4th day, the cook calls you into her sitting room, the first time you've ever been invited into that sacred space. She doesn't offer you a seat. She tells you that you'll be elevated to second kitchen maid at wages of £12 per year. A £4 increase from your scullery salary. You're expected to maintain the same work hours, demonstrate perfect behaviour, and remember that this promotion can be revoked instantly if you prove unsuitable. She also informs you that a new scullery maid will arrive next week, and you're to train her without neglecting your primary duties. In other words, you've climbed one rung up the ladder, and now you're expected to work twice as hard to stay there. That night, lying in your attic room, you examine your damaged hands in the darkness and wonder if this is victory or just a slightly more comfortable form of servitude. You're no longer at the absolute bottom, which means something, but you're also aware that you sacrifice friendships, health, and nearly 2 years of your youth to move from one form of exhausting labour to a slightly different form of exhausting labour. The girl who will arrive next week to take your place in the scullery, will you help her or hinder her? Will you remember what it felt like to be her? Or will you become just another obstacle? Another woman who pulled the ladder up behind her? You don't know yet. Ask yourself in a few months. You think, when you're less tired, though you're always tired now, and suspect you always will be. You see her before you hear her, the housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, moving through the ground floor hallway like a ship cutting through water, serene and unstoppable. But it's the sound that truly announces her presence, the gentle chiming of keys at her waist, dozens of them hanging from an ornate silver chatelaine that catches the light with each step. Those keys represent something more profound than simple access to locked doors. They symbolise trust, authority, and control over the household's most valuable resources. In your 18 months as a kitchen maid, you've never touched those keys, never even been close enough to identify what each one opens. They exist in your world like royal regalia, visible but untouchable, powerful but mysterious. The housekeeper's keys unlock everything that matters in a grand house. The linen closet stacked with sheets worth more than your annual wages. The china cabinets filled with porcelain that could feed your family for a year if sold. the wine cellar containing bottles older than you are, the still room where preserves and medicines are made, the silver safe where the family's flatware lives when not gracing their table. In smaller households, the mistress might keep these keys herself, but in any establishment wealthy enough to employ more than 5 or 6 servants, the keys pass to a housekeeper, and with them passes real power. Mrs. Thornton occupies rooms you've only glimpsed, a private sitting room with actual wallpaper instead of bare plaster, a bedroom to herself rather than the cramped attic dormitory where you sleep with 4 other maids. She takes her meals separately from the lower servants, often in the company of the butler if the household employs one. Dining on leftovers from the family's table rather than the cheaper fare served to you, she's addressed as Mrs., though you've heard whispered rumours she never married, that the title is purely honorary, a mark of her status. She must be 50 at least, her hair completely grey beneath her cap, her face lined with the particular exhaustion that comes from decades of managing other people's lives and properties. What you're only beginning to understand is that the housekeeper is essentially running a small business. In a large Victorian household, she manages a staff that might number 20 or more people, oversees a budget that would reach several £100s annually, maintains inventories of thousands of items, handles hiring and firing, mediates disputes, and serves as the intermediary between the family and the servants. She's accountant, manager, disciplinarian, and sometimes the closest thing to a mother figure that young maids away from home will ever encounter. Some housekeepers are tyrants, others are surprisingly kind within the constraints of the system. Mrs. Thornton falls somewhere in between, strict but not cruel, demanding but occasionally fair. The keys themselves are magnificent objects, far more elaborate than simple brass tools. In wealthy households, the chatelaine might be silver or even gold-plated, an ornate clip that fastens at the waist with chains hanging down, each chain holding a different key. Some chatelaines also include small scissors, a notebook for recording expenses, a pencil, and sometimes a watch. The whole arrangement weighs several pounds and costs more than you'll earn in 3 years. It's both functional tool and status symbol, announcing the housekeeper's presence before she enters a room and serving as a constant reminder of her authority. Here's something fascinating that most people never consider. The housekeeper's keys created a parallel economy within the household. She controlled access to supplies, which meant she controlled who ate what, who wore what, who used which linens and candles and coal. This power could be used benevolently, slipping extra food to a sick maid, providing warmer blankets in winter, or wielded as punishment, withholding basic comforts from servants who displeased her. Historians still argue whether housekeepers were primarily agents of the family's interests, or whether they sometimes used their position to advocate for servants, creating small zones of mercy within an otherwise harsh system. The daily routine of a housekeeper would exhaust someone half her age. Mrs. Thornton rises at 5:30, earlier than everyone except the scullery maid and the kitchen staff. She conducts a morning inspection of the main rooms before the family wakes, checking that fires are lit, that everything is in place, that the house appears to run itself as if by magic. She meets with the cook to plan menus, reviewing the household accounts and the supplies on hand. She checks the linen closets, ensuring that sheets are properly aired and rotated so they wear evenly. She inspects the housemaid's work, running her finger along picture frames and windowsills, checking for the dust that serves as evidence of laziness or incompetence. Around mid-morning, she might meet with the mistress of the house to discuss household matters, upcoming dinner parties, necessary purchases, problems with servants. This is a delicate dance. The housekeeper must appear completely competent and in control, while also deferring to the mistress's authority and accepting criticism gracefully. A smart housekeeper manages her employer as carefully as she manages the servants, presenting problems with solutions already attached. making the mistress feel involved in decisions while actually maintaining control herself. The relationship between mistress and housekeeper could be cordial or combative, and a housekeeper who couldn't navigate this relationship wouldn't last long regardless of her other skills. In the afternoon, Mrs. Thornton might work in her sitting room, updating the household ledgers, writing letters to tradesmen, planning the week's work assignments. She keeps meticulous records of everything: how many candles were used, how much coal was burned, when linens were washed, which china patterns were used for which occasions. These records serve multiple purposes. They prevent theft, identify waste, and provide evidence if the family questions any expenses. A housekeeper could be dismissed if the accounts didn't balance, if inventory went missing, if she couldn't explain every penny spent. Here's a quirky detail that reveals how elaborate these households became. Some grand houses had different sets of china for different types of meals, different occasions, even different seasons. The housekeeper had to know which porcelain to bring out for a formal dinner versus a casual breakfast, which crystal glasses were appropriate for which wines, which tablecloths matched which dining rooms. She maintained mental catalogues of hundreds of items, knowing their location, condition, and proper use. Modern people might use spreadsheets and database software for such tasks. Mrs. Thornton carries it all in her head, supplemented by handwritten ledgers she updates each evening. The housekeeper also serves as moral guardian of the female servants, enforcing rules about behaviour, dress, and respectability. She inspects the maid's appearance each morning, ensuring uniforms are clean and properly worn, hair neatly arranged, aprons spotless. She enforces curfews, prohibits male visitors, and dismisses girls who become pregnant or who are discovered in any romantic or sexual entanglement. This aspect of her role is particularly cruel. She's often an unmarried woman herself, enforcing rules that denied young women any semblance of normal social or romantic life, punishing them for the very human desires she presumably shares. Yet for all her power within the household, Mrs. Thornton remains a servant, subject to dismissal at the family's whim, lacking any real security or autonomy. She might have served this household for 20 years, might know every corner of it better than the family does, might have trained 2 generations of maids, but she can be let go with a month's wages and no pension. The keys she carries are borrowed authority, revocable at any moment. Some housekeepers accumulated savings over decades of service, planning for retirement. Others ended their working lives with nothing, too old to work but with no family to support them, facing the workhouse or worse. You watch Mrs. Thornton pass through the corridor, her keys singing their quiet song of power, and you wonder what it would feel like to carry that weight. The keys represent both possibility and trap, authority that comes at the cost of your entire life, respect earned through decades of subordinating every personal desire to household needs. Some maids aspire to become housekeeper, others see it as a prison with slightly better furniture. You're not sure which perspective is more accurate. Perhaps both. Perhaps the system is designed so that every achievement contains its own diminishment. Every promotion comes with chains only slightly longer than the ones you already wear. You catch glimpses of her sometimes on the main staircase. Miss Caroline, the lady's maid who serves the eldest daughter of the house. She moves differently than other servants, her posture perfectly straight, her uniform not the rough cotton you wear but fine black wool, with a pristine white collar that somehow never wilts despite the humidity. Her hands, when you see them, are smooth and pale, nothing like your reddened, work-damaged fingers. She carries herself with an air of belonging to a different species entirely, as if breathing the same air as the family has transformed her into something halfway between servant and lady. In the bizarre hierarchy of the household, she occupies the most peculiar position, intimate with the mistress's body and secrets, yet utterly dependent on that mistress's whims. The lady's maid wakes when her mistress wakes, which in this household means around 8 o'clock, positively luxurious compared to your 4:30 mornings. But what she gains in sleep she sacrifices in privacy. She's never truly off duty because her mistress might summon her at any hour. You've heard stories of ladies' maids being called at 2 in the morning to redress their mistress's hair for a late-night party, or being required to sit up until dawn waiting to help an employer undress after a ball. The intimacy between mistress and lady's maid exceeds that of many marriages. She sees her employer naked, knows her body's imperfections, understands which corset-lacing hides which figure flaws, witnesses monthly cycles and medical problems and the gradual deterioration of youth. Miss Caroline's morning begins in her mistress's bedroom, drawing back curtains, opening windows, bringing morning tea on a tray. She lays out the morning dress, having already decided which gown suits the day's weather and planned activities. The lady's maid must understand fashion with the sophistication of a professional modiste. She knows which colours complement her mistress's complexion, which styles are currently fashionable, which accessories complete an ensemble. In wealthy households, the mistress might change clothes 5 or 6 times daily: morning dress, walking dress, afternoon dress, tea gown, dinner dress, evening gown. Each change requires the lady's maid's assistance. Each outfit needs perfect execution. But the real artistry shows in hairdressing, where a skilled lady's maid becomes something close to a sculptor. Victorian and Edwardian hairstyles were architectural achievements, elaborate constructions of curls, braids, and waves that required pomades, hot irons, false hair pieces, and sometimes literal frameworks hidden within the hair. Miss Caroline can create any style the fashion magazines display, can transform her mistress's hair from simple morning waves to evening sophistication, adorned with jewelled combs and feather ornaments. This skill alone makes her valuable. A lady's maid who couldn't handle hair would be dismissed regardless of her other talents. Here's something most people don't realise about this position. The lady's maid often received her mistress's cast-off clothing as part of her compensation, and these garments had significant resale value. A silk evening gown worn once by an aristocratic lady might sell to a middle-class woman desperate for fashionable clothes, earning the lady's maid several months' worth of regular wages. Some ladies' maids supplemented their income substantially through these sales, developing relationships with second-hand clothing dealers. Others kept the clothes themselves, building wardrobes far superior to what their wages could purchase, wearing on their days off the same silks and satins they'd helped their mistresses into days before. The relationship between mistress and lady's maid exists in a strange emotional territory that historians still argue about. On one hand, these women spent hours together daily in the most private circumstances, discussing everything from fashion to family troubles to romantic intrigues. Some mistresses genuinely confided in their ladies' maids, treating them almost as friends. On the other hand, the power imbalance remained absolute. The mistress could dismiss the maid instantly, ruin her reputation with a poor reference, or withhold wages for imagined offences. Intimacy mixed with complete vulnerability created psychological dynamics that could turn toxic quickly. Miss Caroline maintains her mistress's wardrobe with the care of a museum curator. Each gown requires specific maintenance. Silks must be carefully folded to prevent creasing. Woolens need regular brushing to prevent moth damage. Whites require special attention to prevent yellowing. Delicate laces must be cleaned with extraordinary care. She mends torn hems invisibly, removes stains using secret techniques passed down from experienced maids, refreshes ribbons and trims, replaces worn buttons. A closet full of expensive clothing represents a substantial investment, and the lady's maid serves as its protector and manager. When the mistress travels, Miss Caroline accompanies her, which sounds glamorous until you consider the reality. She packs enormous trunks containing everything her mistress might need, ensuring nothing is forgotten. She travels in second-class compartments while her mistress enjoys first-class comfort. She stays in servants' quarters at hotels and country houses, often sharing rooms with other ladies' maids. She works in unfamiliar spaces with unfamiliar resources, expected to maintain the same perfect standards regardless of circumstances. Some ladies' maids enjoyed travel, seeing it as adventure. Others found it exhausting, being always on display in new households where their skills were constantly evaluated. The skills required for this position take years to develop, which is why ladies' maids were usually older than other servants, often in their late 20s or 30s. You couldn't simply promote a housemaid to lady's maid the way you might promote a scullery maid to kitchen maid. The knowledge was too specialised, too crucial, too visible to the family. Many ladies' maids trained under experienced predecessors, learning the mysterious arts of fashion and beauty maintenance through apprenticeship. Some attended actual training programs in large cities, though these were rare and expensive. Here's a quirky detail. Ladies' maids often developed expertise in amateur medical care, because they witnessed their mistresses' health problems intimately. They knew which tonics helped with headaches, which preparations soothed skin irritations, how to apply leeches for various ailments, how to manage menstrual discomfort. They weren't doctors or nurses, but they accumulated practical knowledge that made them valuable beyond their primary duties. Some mistresses relied on their ladies' maids' judgment about health matters more than they trusted actual physicians. The secrecy required of a lady's maid exceeded that demanded of other servants. She knew everything: affairs, financial troubles, family scandals, secret pregnancies, health problems the family wanted hidden. She saw the cosmetics that created the illusion of natural beauty, the padding that enhanced figures, the hair dyes that maintained youthful appearance. She knew which social obligations were actually romantic assignations, which sick headaches were hangovers from too much champagne. A lady's maid who gossiped about her mistress would never work in a respectable house again. But the temptation must have been enormous, carrying all those secrets locked inside while moving through a world desperate for aristocratic gossip. Miss Caroline earns £35 annually, nearly 3 times your kitchen maid wages, plus room and board and those valuable cast-off clothes, but she's also 40 years old, never married, with no life outside her mistress's orbit. She has no friends among the other servants, who view her with suspicion and resentment, seeing her as the mistress's spy. She can't socialise with the family because she's still a servant. She exists in profound isolation, intimate with everyone and connected to no one. When you pass her on the stairs, you notice the loneliness in her eyes. Despite the fine wool dress and smooth hands, maybe the keys the housekeeper carries are chains, you think, but at least she has a kingdom of her own. Miss Caroline has only borrowed proximity to someone else's life, and when that mistress dies or dismisses her, she'll have nothing except memories of silks she touched but never truly owned. You notice her during breakfast in the servants' hall, Miss Hartley, the governess, entering quietly and then hesitating at the threshold as if uncertain where she belongs. She's not quite 30, dressed in a plain grey dress that's respectable but worn. Her hair pulled back severely in a style that aims for dignity but achieves only a kind of anxious primness. The other servants glance at her and then deliberately look away, continuing their conversations as if she hasn't appeared. She takes a seat at the far end of the table, isolated even in a crowded room, and eats her porridge in silence. You feel something unexpected? Pity, maybe, or recognition. She's trapped in a space even more awkward than yours. Educated enough to feel superior to servants, but employed enough to be excluded from the family. She's nobody's colleague and nobody's equal, floating in social limbo. The governess occupies what might be the loneliest position in the entire household structure. She's been hired to educate the children, 3 daughters aged 7 to 14 in this house, which means she needs genuine learning. Miss Hartley speaks French and passable German, plays piano competently, understands literature and history and geography, can teach mathematics and drawing and needlework. This education places her far above you and the other servants in knowledge, but it doesn't grant her any authority over them. The housekeeper doesn't report to her, the cook doesn't ask her opinion, the housemaids don't defer to her. She exists outside the servant hierarchy entirely, which sounds liberating until you realise it means she has no place at all. She takes her meals with the children in the nursery, not with the family in the dining room, and not with the servants in the hall, except for breakfast, which she eats with the upper servants in an atmosphere of mutual discomfort. The family doesn't want her at their table because she's paid labour, hired help, someone who works for money. The servants don't want her in their midst because she's educated, refined, essentially a lady who's fallen on hard times, so she sits alone, or with the children who are her charges but never her friends, eating meals that taste of isolation regardless of what's actually on the plate. Her room is in the nursery wing, close to the children but separate from both family quarters and servant attics. It's better than your cramped dormitory. She has her own small space, at least, but it's also a kind of exile, neither upstairs nor downstairs, neither genteel nor working class. She can hear the children breathing at night, can hear the family moving through their evening routines, can hear the servants talking and laughing in the distance. But she belongs to none of these worlds. Historians still argue whether governesses experienced their position as a form of genteel poverty or as an opportunity for independence. But from where you sit watching Miss Hartley eat her silent breakfast, independence looks remarkably similar to loneliness. The work itself is demanding in ways different from your physical labour. Miss Hartley spends 8 to 10 hours daily with the children, teaching lessons, supervising their exercise, correcting their French pronunciation, listening to them practice piano, monitoring their needlework, reading aloud from improving books. She must maintain discipline without physical punishment. Governesses who struck their charges were dismissed instantly, which means she relies on moral authority. Disappointment, and the threat of reporting misbehaviour to parents, the children sense her powerlessness and sometimes exploit it, testing boundaries, complaining to their mother about imagined slights, making her life miserable in the casual cruelty children can inflict. Here's what makes the position even more precarious. The governess is usually only needed for a specific period in the children's lives. Once the daughters are old enough for finishing school or marriage prospects, or once sons are old enough for proper schools, the governess becomes unnecessary. Miss Hartley knows that in perhaps 5 years, when the youngest daughter no longer needs education, she'll be dismissed. She'll receive a reference, certainly, but then she'll need to find another family with children at the right age, and she'll be that much older, competing against younger governesses. The position has no pension, no security, no path forward except finding the next temporary post. The governess's social status confusion extended beyond the household into wider society. When the family attended church, where did Miss Hartley sit? Not with the family in their prominent pew, but not with the servants in the back either. When the family hosted dinner parties, Miss Hartley remained in the nursery, not important enough to join the company, but too refined to socialise with the kitchen staff. When the family travelled, she accompanied them to care for the children, but stayed in inferior accommodations and ate separately. She existed in a perpetual state of not quite belonging that some women found unbearable. Many governesses came from what the Victorians called reduced circumstances, genteel families that had lost their money through bad investments, business failures, or the death of the male breadwinner. These women had been raised to be ladies, educated in accomplishments meant to attract husbands, never trained for paid employment. When family fortunes collapsed, they had few options, marry quickly and perhaps badly. become a burden on relatives or work. And the only respectable work for an educated woman was teaching, which meant becoming a governess. So Miss Hartley might have grown up in a house like this one, might have been served by women like you, and now finds herself neither servant nor mistress, ghosting through someone else's home. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the strangeness of the position. Some families expected their governesses to be fashionable and presentable when visitors arrived, essentially using them as display objects demonstrating the family's refinement. But these same families provided minimal clothing allowances and expected the governess to somehow maintain a genteel appearance on £20 to £30 annually. Miss Hartley's grey dress has been mended multiple times, the cuffs turned and re-sewn when they frayed. She can't afford to replace it, but she's judged harshly if she appears shabby. It's an impossible standard, designed to keep her anxious and grateful. The relationship between governesses and their charges varied wildly. Some children genuinely loved their governesses, maintaining correspondence for years after childhood ended. Others treated them with contempt, learning from their parents that paid employees deserved no respect. The governess had to win the children's affection without overstepping boundaries, maintain discipline without becoming a tyrant, demonstrate affection without presuming to replace their mother. It was an exhausting emotional tightrope that many women walked poorly, leading to dismissal for being too familiar or too cold. Often with no clear understanding of where the proper balance lay, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre captured this painful existence so perfectly that the novel became a sensation partly because thousands of governesses recognised themselves in Jane's struggles. The book's fantasy resolution, the governess marrying into wealth and becoming the employer's equal, was exactly that. A fantasy, virtually impossible in reality. Real governesses grew old in their profession, moving from household to household, saving what little they could, and hoping they'd accumulate enough to survive when they became too old to work. Many didn't. The workhouse received numerous elderly governesses who'd spent decades educating other people's children and ended their lives in desperate poverty. You finish your breakfast and leave the servants' hall. Passing Miss Hartley still sitting alone with her cooling tea, she glances up, and for a moment your eyes meet. You see something in her expression. Is it envy of your clear position in the hierarchy, your belonging however lowly? Or is it pity for your rough hands and early mornings, your lack of education and prospects? Maybe it's neither. Maybe she's just tired, like everyone in this house is tired, worn down by the particular cruelties of her particular cage. You think about the strange fact that you might actually be more fortunate than she is. At least, you know where you stand. At least you belong somewhere, even if that somewhere is the bottom. She floats in between, belonging nowhere, and perhaps that's the worst position of all. You're 19 now, and you've noticed William, the footman, watching you during servants' meals. He's 22, handsome in his livery, and when he smiles at you across the table, your heart performs acrobatics that feel both thrilling and dangerous. You know the rules, every servant knows the rules, but your body doesn't care about rules, and neither, apparently, does your imagination, which has started conjuring scenarios involving William's hands and your waist and stolen moments in dark hallways. The cook catches you daydreaming one afternoon and boxes your ears, reminding you sharply that followers are absolutely forbidden, that romance leads to ruin, that you're here to work, not to carry on like a common street girl. The term followers itself reveals Victorian anxieties. Young men who followed female servants, waiting outside houses hoping for glimpses of their sweethearts, were seen as threats to household order and female virtue. Most employment contracts explicitly forbade followers, and housekeepers enforced this rule with zealous vigilance. A maid discovered speaking with a man could be dismissed immediately, without wages, without references. cast into the street for the crime of normal human attraction. The system demanded that young women in their physical prime, living in close quarters with young men in footman and groom positions, somehow suppress every natural impulse toward romance, flirtation, or sexual expression. The prohibition wasn't really about morality, though employers framed it that way. It was about control and economics. A servant who married would leave employment. Married women rarely remained in service except in the most impoverished circumstances. The employer had invested time in training you, had finally gotten you to the point of usefulness, and marriage would mean starting over with a new girl. Additionally, pregnancy was an absolute catastrophe from the employer's perspective. A pregnant servant was useless for work, couldn't be kept on for moral reasons, and represented visible proof that the household's supervision had failed. So the rules around romance were draconian, designed to prevent any situation that might lead to a servant leaving or becoming pregnant. But humans being humans, relationships developed anyway, conducted in secrecy and constant fear. You and William begin finding moments, a few whispered words while passing on the stairs, his hand briefly touching yours when no one's watching, a note slipped into your apron pocket. The subterfuge adds intensity to emotions that might otherwise be simple attraction. Forbidden love always burns hotter. You meet in the garden at dusk when you should be preparing vegetables, stealing 10 minutes that feel like stolen jewels, kissing quickly and breaking apart at every sound, your heart hammering with fear and desire in equal measure. Other servants notice. Of course. Nothing stays secret in a household where everyone lives on top of each other, where privacy is essentially impossible. The first kitchen maid who has always disliked you watches with calculating eyes. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, seems to develop an uncanny ability to appear wherever you and William might encounter each other. You realise the entire household has become your prison, with wardens disguised as fellow servants. The woman you sleep next to every night could report you. The housemaid you pass in corridors could inform on you. Anyone's jealousy or adherence to rules could end your employment. Here's what nobody tells young servants. The rules apply differently depending on your value to the household. A talented cook or an experienced lady's maid might get away with romantic entanglements that would see a scullery maid dismissed. You're a kitchen maid now, moderately valuable but easily replaced. William, as a footman, has slightly more leverage. Men in service generally did, though they face their own restrictions. If you're discovered, you'll definitely be dismissed. He might be, or he might merely be reprimanded, told to cease contact with you, and retained because finding good footmen was harder than finding kitchen maids. 3 months into your secret romance, disaster strikes. Though not the disaster you most feared, William tells you he's been offered a position in London, with better wages and better prospects, and he's going to take it. He suggests, tentatively, not quite meeting your eyes, that you might find a position there too, that you might continue seeing each other in a city where nobody knows you, where you'd have more freedom. It sounds like a proposal but isn't quite. It sounds like possibility but carries no promises. You realise that whatever you imagined this relationship was, he imagined something different, something that doesn't include actually committing to you in any permanent way. The alternative to romance was, of course, marriage. But marriage for servants was complicated in ways that reveal how completely the system controlled your life. To marry, you needed your employer's permission in many households. You needed enough saved wages to establish a home, which meant years of accumulating the pittance left after purchasing necessities. You needed to find a husband whose wages, combined with whatever you could earn, would support a household, and most working-class men earned barely enough to support themselves. The fantasy of marrying a tradesman or shopkeeper who could keep you in modest comfort was exactly that. A fantasy most servants never achieved. Historians still argue whether domestic service delayed marriage for working-class women, or whether it was simply that poverty delayed marriage, and service was a symptom rather than a cause. Either way, the statistics are striking. Female servants married later than women in other occupations, and many never married at all. Living in your employer's household meant no opportunity to meet men outside their controlled environment, no chance to develop relationships naturally, no space for courtship. Your entire youth passed in a cage, and by the time you aged out of service or saved enough to leave, you might be 30 or 35, considered past marriageable age by the standards of the time. Pregnancy outside marriage was an absolute catastrophe that could destroy a servant's life completely. A pregnant woman would be dismissed instantly, without references, often without full wages. Her reputation would be ruined, making future employment nearly impossible. She'd likely end up in the workhouse, or worse, raising a child in poverty with no support and no prospects. Yet pregnancies happened, whether from consensual relationships, coercion by employers or male servants, or sexual assault. The Victorian era's obsession with female purity made no accommodation for the realities of young women living in situations where they were vulnerable and powerless. Here's a detail that sounds quirky until you consider its implications. Some households required female servants to sign contracts promising they wouldn't marry during their term of employment, sometimes for periods of 5 years or more. Breaking this contract meant forfeiting accumulated wages and references. The legal enforceability of such contracts was questionable, but for an uneducated servant who didn't understand the law and feared her employer's power, the contract might as well have been iron chains. You signed away your right to normal human milestones, marriage, children, building a life, in exchange for wages barely sufficient to survive. You tell William you need time to think about London, but you already know your answer. You're tired of secret moments and whispered promises, tired of feeling like a criminal for wanting what every person wants, to be loved, to be chosen, to matter to someone. But you're also realistic enough to understand that leaving this position without another secured is dangerous, that following a man to London based on vague suggestions is foolish, that you've seen this story before and know how it ends. The other kitchen maid, 3 years ago, who left to follow a footman to Manchester and ended up in a brothel because he abandoned her and she couldn't find respectable work. You remember her? The night before William leaves, he kisses you in the garden one final time, and you let yourself imagine, just for a moment, a different world. A world where servants could love openly, could marry without asking permission, could build lives that included both work and family. A world where your body and your heart belong to you instead of to your employer. But you live in this world, not that imaginary one, and in this world, his departure feels inevitable. He leaves on Thursday. By Saturday, you hear he's already walking out with a girl in his new household in London. By the next month, you've stopped thinking about him except occasionally, when you're too tired to guard your thoughts. Romance, you learn, is another luxury you can't afford, another thing the system takes from you, another way this life bleeds you dry of everything that makes being young worthwhile. You're standing in the drawing room for the first time in your life, not to work but to be inspected. Mrs. Henderson, a middle-class woman whose husband owns a moderately successful drapery business, is interviewing you for a position in her household. She's younger than you expected, perhaps 30, wearing a dress that's trying very hard to look expensive but doesn't quite succeed. Her hands fidget with her reticule as she examines you, and you realise with a shock that she's nervous too, nervous about hiring her first servant, about proving she can manage a household, about demonstrating to her neighbours that she's arrived at respectability. You're not just a worker she's hiring, you're evidence of her social ascent, and the pressure of that makes her voice sharper than perhaps she intends. The explosion of middle-class households employing servants in the mid to late Victorian era changed domestic service fundamentally. Suddenly, it wasn't just aristocrats and wealthy merchants who kept staffs. Shopkeepers, clerks, minor professionals, and anyone with pretensions to respectability scrambled to hire at least one maid. In 1851, there were roughly 1 million domestic servants in Britain. By 1891, that number had nearly doubled. The expanding middle class needed servants to prove they'd escaped the working class, to demonstrate that the wife was a lady who didn't do her own rough work. Keeping a servant became less about actual need and more about social signalling, about maintaining boundaries between yourself and the people you'd recently left behind. Mrs. Henderson is representative of this new employer class, and she's nervously imitating what she thinks wealthy ladies do when hiring servants. She asks about your previous position, your skills, your references. She inquires, trying to sound casual, whether you have followers, whether you attend church regularly, whether you're prone to illness. She's reading from a mental script she's absorbed from a magazine advice columns and conversations with other aspiring ladies, trying to perform the role of mistress convincingly. You answer carefully, presenting yourself as capable but not too confident, experienced but grateful for this opportunity, moral but not preachy. You're also performing, and you're better at it than she is because you've had more practice. What's interesting about these middle-class households is that they often employed just 1 or 2 servants, which meant those servants did everything. Mrs. Henderson explains that you'd be the only maid, a maid of all work. A term that means exactly what it sounds like. You'd do scullery work and kitchen work and housemaid work and laundry work. All the labour that in a grand house would be divided among 6 or 7 specialists. You'd rise at 5, light fires, prepare breakfast, serve it, clean up, do the washing, make beds, dust and sweep, prepare lunch, serve it, clean up again, run errands, prepare dinner, serve it, clean up once more, and finally collapse into bed around 10. 15 hours daily of constant labour, with perhaps 1 afternoon off per month. The wages Mrs. Henderson offers reflect this new economy of service. She'll pay you £14 annually, more than you earned as a scullery maid, but less than you made as a kitchen maid in a larger household, and far less per task if you calculate what you're actually doing. But she's also offering something that large households rarely did: visibility and a kind of importance. You'd be her only servant, which means you'd be essential, not replaceable. You'd manage the household in ways that gave you real autonomy. You wouldn't have a cook breathing down your neck or a housekeeper inspecting your work with white gloves. You'd answer only to Mrs. Henderson, and if you managed her correctly, you could create a relatively comfortable situation. Historians still argue whether employment in middle-class households was better or worse than positions in aristocratic homes. The work was arguably harder, more tasks, longer hours, less specialised. But the relationships were often less formal. The social distance between mistress and maid smaller, the possibility of genuine regard more likely. Some servants preferred the anonymity of large establishments where you were just one among many. Others thrived in small households where they became indispensable, developing relationships that occasionally resembled affection, or at least mutual dependence. Here's something fascinating about this middle-class scramble for servants. It created enormous anxiety about maintaining proper social distinctions. Mrs. Henderson probably grew up doing her own housework, might have been in service herself before marriage. Now she's desperately trying to establish that she's different from you, that the gulf between mistress and maid is vast and unbridgeable, that you'll call her ma'am and use the back stairs and never presume to think of yourselves as equals. The performance of class distinction became more exaggerated precisely because the actual distinctions were so recent and fragile. Aristocrats who'd always had servants could afford to be casual about social distance. Mrs. Henderson, newly arrived at the status of employing help, must emphasise it constantly lest anyone forget. The employment contract she proposes is typical of middle-class households and reveals the anxieties driving this arrangement. You'll wear a uniform she provides. This establishes you as her servant, visible proof of her status. You'll eat separately from the family. This maintains social boundaries. You'll have one afternoon off monthly from 2 o'clock to 9 o'clock. This gives you minimal freedom while ensuring you're available for most work hours. You'll receive no visitors, male or female. This prevents you from developing any life outside her household. You'll attend church with the family, sitting separately. This demonstrates her religiosity and supervision of your morals. Every clause exists to define and maintain the relationship of mistress over servant, to prevent any possibility of you forgetting your place. What Mrs. Henderson doesn't mention, but you've learned from other maids, is that working in small middle-class households often meant closer surveillance and more emotional labour. In a large establishment, you could disappear into your role, be anonymous, maintain psychological distance from employers. In a household like this, you'd be constantly visible, constantly interacting with Mrs. Henderson, unable to escape her moods, her anxieties, her need for reassurance that she's managing you correctly. You'd become part of her social performance, evidence she displays to neighbours and visitors, proof she's achieved respectability. The exhaustion wouldn't just be physical, it would be emotional. The constant work of managing her ego along with managing the household. The boom in middle-class servant employment also created fierce competition for workers, which gave servants slightly more leverage than in previous eras. If Mrs. Henderson proved unbearable, you could likely find another position relatively quickly. There were more households seeking servants than there were servants available. This shifted power dynamics subtly. Employers had to treat servants well enough to retain them, had to compete on wages and working conditions at least marginally. Registry offices opened in cities, businesses that matched servants with employers for a fee, and servants could increasingly shop around for positions rather than depending on personal references alone. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the absurdity of this social scramble. Etiquette books proliferated giving advice on managing servants, and these books often revealed that the authors understood neither servants nor management. One popular guide suggested that mistresses should supervise every task personally to ensure it was done properly, which rather defeated the purpose of having a servant. Another recommended that servants be given moral lectures daily to improve their characters, as if you needed lectures rather than better wages and reasonable hours. The middle class was learning to employ servants without any traditional knowledge of how to do so, making up rules as they went along, creating systems that were often more oppressive than necessary because they were overcompensating for their own uncertainties. You accept Mrs. Henderson's offer because the alternatives are worse, returning to the larger household where advancement is blocked, or trying factory work, which pays marginally better but destroys your health faster. You'll be a maid of all work, a general servant, a catch-all designation that means you'll do everything for everyone and receive minimal recognition for any of it. But you'll also be essential rather than replaceable, visible rather than invisible. And that carries its own small power. You'll learn to manage Mrs. Henderson's anxieties, to make her feel successful at being a mistress, to perform your role so well that she can perform hers convincingly. It's exhausting to contemplate, but then everything about service is exhausting, and at least this exhaustion comes with a kind of importance, however limited. You curtsy, she's clearly expecting it, and tell her you're grateful for the opportunity. She beams, relieved and proud, and you realise you've both just entered a performance that will define your lives for however long this arrangement lasts. Your new uniform arrives 3 days before you're due to start at Mrs. Henderson's house, and you unfold it with a mixture of curiosity and resignation. The dress is dark blue cotton, not the brown of your previous scullery days or the black of hire servants, but a middle ground that announces your general help, neither specialised nor entirely lowly. 2 white aprons accompany it, one for morning work and one slightly finer for afternoon, when you might answer the door to visitors. There are also caps, those symbols of servitude that mark you as clearly as a brand. Plain white cotton affairs that must be spotlessly clean and perfectly starched at all times. You calculate quickly. Maintaining this uniform to Mrs. Henderson standards will consume hours each week and require purchasing starch and soap from your own wages. The uniform system in Victorian households was elaborate and revealing, a visual language that communicated exact social positions without words. In grand houses, different servants wore different colours and styles. Footmen in livery with brass buttons, housemaids in striped cotton, ladies' maids in black wool, cooks in white aprons over dark dresses. The complexity rivalled military insignia, allowing anyone with knowledge to identify a person's exact role at a glance. Your blue cotton dress announces your middle tier, respectable but not elevated, a working servant rather than an upper one. The white aprons and caps, which must remain pristine despite scrubbing floors and cooking meals, represent the impossible standards you're expected to maintain. Your wages are £14 annually, paid quarterly in arrears, which means you work 3 months before seeing any money. From this, you must purchase certain items, additional undergarments, stockings that wear out quickly from constant movement, shoes that your employer doesn't provide, soap for personal washing, and any non-uniform clothing for your single afternoon off per month. You calculate that after these necessary expenses, you might save £4 or £5 yearly if you're extraordinarily frugal and experience no emergencies. £5 annually for 15-hour days, 7 days a week except those precious monthly afternoons. You convert it to hours in your head, and the mathematics is depressing enough that you stop calculating. The rulebook misses. Henderson provides an actual printed document she's purchased from a stationer, outlines behavioural expectations in numbing detail. You must rise at 5 o'clock without exception, even in winter darkness. You must never be seen by family in curl papers or in a state of undress. You must never sing or whistle while working. You must answer to your surname only, never your Christian name. You must never sit in family rooms even when cleaning them. You must never use the front stairs unless carrying something too large for the back stairs. You must never speak unless spoken to. You must never make eye contact with male visitors. The list continues for 3 pages, a litany of prohibitions that essentially demand you erase your personality entirely while working. Here's what strikes you most forcefully. These rules govern not just your labour but your entire existence. There's no boundary between work time and personal time because you live where you work, and your employer's authority extends into every moment. When you sleep in quarters she provides. When you eat food she purchases. When you have a few hours off, you leave from and return to her property. She doesn't just employ you, she contains you. And the uniform you'll wear is the visible symbol of that containment. You're not a person who happens to do domestic work. You're a domestic servant who might, in tiny fragments of time, briefly be a person. The rules around food are particularly revealing of the employer's mindset. You'll eat after the family eats from different dishes, often different food entirely. Any leftovers from family meals go to Mrs. Henderson's use. She might give them to you, or she might save them for the family's next meal, or she might do something else entirely. They're not your leftovers to expect or claim. Your designated meals are bread, butter, tea, occasionally cheese or cold meat, and vegetables, adequate to prevent starvation, insufficient for the physical labour you'll perform. Many servants supplemented their diets by purchasing additional food from their wages, or by the technically illegal practice of taking small amounts from household stores. The line between survival and theft was often invisible. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with regulating servants' behaviour was about maintaining household efficiency or about psychological domination. The sheer number and specificity of rules suggests something beyond practical necessity, an impulse to control every aspect of another person's existence, to reduce them to a function rather than allow them to remain fully human. You must enter rooms silently, move soundlessly, essentially exist as a ghost who performs tasks but creates no disturbance, demands no attention, claims no space. The ideal servant was invisible until needed, then appeared instantly and perfectly, then vanished again. Your uniform includes one peculiar accessory, a small cloth bag that you're meant to carry in your apron pocket at all times. Mrs. Henderson explains, with obvious discomfort, that this is for collecting any hair or debris you find while cleaning, so you're never seen carrying refuse in your hands. It's such a specific, telling detail. The idea that witnessing you dispose of household dirt would somehow contaminate the family's refined atmosphere. You must clean constantly but never be seen in the act of cleaning, must maintain perfect order through labour that remains invisible and unacknowledged. Here's a quirky detail that sounds absurd until you realise how seriously it was taken. Many households had rules about which servants could walk on which sides of hallways, creating traffic patterns as rigid as road systems. You, as the general servant, used the left side of corridors when carrying supplies, the right side when not carrying anything, and the centre only in emergencies. This prevented collision, theoretically, but also served to choreograph servant movement into predictable, controllable patterns. You learned the house's geography not as spaces you inhabited, but as routes you traversed according to strict protocols. The cap you must wear deserves special consideration because it represents something beyond mere uniform. Caps marked you as a servant instantly and unmistakably, removing any possibility of being mistaken for a middle-class woman. Even in your hours off duty when you might wear your own clothes, some servants removed their caps the instant they left the house, on their afternoons off. Desperate to walk through the world without that mark of servitude. Others kept them on, too tired to care or too habituated to remove them. The cap also had practical purposes. It kept hair contained while working, but its primary function was symbolic, a visible badge of your status that could never be hidden or forgotten. The starch required to maintain the crisp whiteness of aprons and caps was expensive and time-consuming to apply. You'd need to wash these items frequently, boil starch, dip the fabric, press it while still slightly damp with a heavy iron heated on the stove. This labour occurred during your supposed free time, late at night after finishing work or before dawn before starting. The cruel irony was that maintaining the appearance of effortless perfection required enormous effort that was itself supposed to remain invisible. Your employer saw only pristine uniforms and assumed they simply remained that way. Never considering the labour required to maintain them, you fold the uniform carefully, already feeling its weight though you haven't yet put it on. These clothes will become a second skin, more familiar than your own body, worn so constantly that on your rare days off you'll feel strange in regular dress. You'll smell like work, lye soap, coal dust, cooking odours, no matter how much you wash. Because the uniform absorbs everything, you'll move differently in it. The practice servant's glide that minimises noise and presence. You'll become, in some sense, the uniform rather than the person wearing it, a function rather than an individual. Tomorrow you start at Mrs. Henderson's house, and you fold away the last fragments of whatever you were before service. Knowing the girl who emerges in that blue dress and white cap will be someone different, someone smaller, Someone whose primary purpose is to be useful while remaining unseen. Mrs. Henderson stands in her kitchen, your kitchen now. Technically. Though you'll never think of it that way, watching you scrub the floor with an expression you're learning to read is not quite disapproval, not quite satisfaction. Something caught between criticism and the desire to seem like a competent mistress who has everything under control. She's been hovering all the morning, offering advice on tasks you've been doing for years, rearranging items you've just organised, explaining how she wants things done in ways that contradict what she said yesterday. You realise with a sinking feeling that this is going to be the pattern. She's as trapped by this relationship as you are, and she's going to make you feel every moment of her uncertainty. The relationship between female employers and female servants might be the most psychologically complex aspect of the entire system. These were women employing women, mistresses commanding maids, and the dynamics couldn't be reduced to simple exploitation or straightforward class warfare. Mrs. Henderson is barely 10 years older than you, probably came from circumstances not dramatically different from yours, and might have been in service herself before marrying Mr. Henderson. Yet now she must maintain absolute authority over you, must establish and enforce boundaries that prevent any recognition of your shared womanhood, must perform the role of superior even when she's uncertain or wrong. Some mistresses govern through kindness laced with condescension, treating servants like children who needed patient guidance and firm discipline. They might give you cast-off clothing, let you have extra food occasionally, ask about your health with what seemed like genuine concern. But this kindness was always conditional, always revocable, always structured by the fundamental power imbalance. A kind mistress could become a tyrant instantly if you forgot your place. If you mistook her occasional warmth for actual friendship, if you presumed on her generosity. The kindness was real, perhaps, but it was also a form of control, a way of ensuring loyalty without actually sharing power. Other mistresses governed through distance and coldness, maintaining ice-perfect formality that prevented any possibility of emotional connection. These women barely looked at you while giving orders, referred to you only by surname, corrected mistakes with cut-in remarks that left you feeling worthless. They seemed to find your presence distasteful, as if your poverty and lowliness might be contagious, as if allowing any warmth would contaminate them. You often wondered if these cold mistresses feared becoming like you, if their cruelty was designed to convince themselves that the distance between you was vast and permanent. Mrs. Henderson oscillates between these approaches, sometimes chatty and almost friendly, other times rigid and demanding. You realise she's trying to figure out how to be a mistress just as you once figured out how to be a servant. And her experimentation makes your life unpredictable. One day she might sit at the kitchen table while you work, talking about her childhood, treating you almost like a companion. The next day she might criticise everything you do, finding fault with tasks she praised yesterday, reducing you to anxious apologising for perceived failures you don't understand. Here's what most people don't realise about the mistress-servant relationship. The mistress often spent more time with her servant than with anyone else, including her husband. Mrs. Henderson is home all day while Mr. Henderson works at his drapery business. You're the only other adult in the house for hours each day. This enforced proximity created strange intimacies. Mistresses who knew their servants' moods, ailments, family troubles in detail. Servants who knew their mistress's fears, disappointments, marital problems. The knowledge flowed both ways, creating relationships that were deeply personal yet fundamentally unequal, intimate yet utterly hierarchical. The psychological toll of maintaining this relationship fell primarily on you, the servant. You had to read your mistress's moods perfectly, adjusting your behaviour to accommodate her emotional state. If Mrs. Henderson seemed upset, you needed to be extra efficient and unobtrusive. If she seemed bored, you might risk a few remarks to entertain her, but not so many that you appeared presumptuous. If she seemed critical, you had to accept correction gracefully, even if it was unjust, even if you knew your way was better. You were perpetually managing her emotions while suppressing your own, performing emotional labour that was never acknowledged or compensated. Historians still argue whether female employers were harsher or more lenient than male employers, and the evidence is contradictory. Some sources suggest women were crueler to their servants, projecting onto them frustrations from their own limited lives, punishing in servants the powerlessness they felt in their own circumstances. Other sources suggest women were more sympathetic, understanding servants' struggles from their own experiences with domesticity and constraint. Probably both were true simultaneously. The same mistress could be kind and cruel, understanding and callous, sometimes within the same conversation. The shared experience of being female created potential solidarity that the class system worked hard to destroy. You and Mrs. Henderson both dealt with monthly cycles, both understood pregnancy fears, both navigated a world where men held most legal and economic power, yet the household structure demanded you ignore these commonalities, that you pretend her experience as a woman was completely different from yours. When she complained about her husband's demands or her lack of freedom, you had to sympathise while maintaining that her constrained life was far superior to your servitude. When you struggled with exhaustion or illness, you had to minimise it lest you appear weak or demanding, never suggesting that your female suffering might equal hers. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the strangeness of this relationship. Many mistresses kept detailed journals documenting their servants' failings, recording mistakes and problems with dates and descriptions. These journals served multiple purposes. They were evidence if dismissal became necessary. They were reassurance that problems stemmed from servants' inadequacies rather than the mistress's management. And they were a form of surveillance, a written record that made servants feel constantly observed and judged. Mrs. Henderson keeps such a journal, you've noticed, and you wonder what she's written about you. What version of yourself exists in her careful handwriting? Sometimes you catch Mrs. Henderson looking at you with an expression you can't quite interpret. Is it envy that you're young and still have your health despite the hard work? Is it contempt for your rough hands and rough speech? Is it recognition of shared womanhood quickly suppressed because acknowledging it would undermine her authority? Maybe it's all of these simultaneously, a complex emotional stew that she can't sort through any better than you can. The system forces both of you into roles that require you to be simultaneously intimate and alien, close and distant, similar and entirely different. The tragedy is that in another world, you and Mrs. Henderson might have been friends, or at least allies. You're both young women navigating a society that gives you limited options, both trapped by economic systems neither of you controls, both exhausted by demands you can't quite meet. But this world doesn't allow that friendship, that alliance. The household hierarchy requires your subordination, and Mrs. Henderson's recently acquired respectability requires your deference, so you scrub her floors while she watches, both of you performing the roles assigned to you, both of you lonely in different ways, both of you unable to bridge the distance that society has constructed between you. You finish the floor and wait for her verdict, and she nods approval before leaving the kitchen. And the moment of potential connection passes without either of you acknowledging it was there. You're reading a pamphlet that someone pressed into your hand during your monthly afternoon off. A cheaply printed thing that smells of fresh ink and radical ideas. The servant question, a call for reform, announces the title, and inside are demands so audacious they make your heart race. Fixed working hours, 1 full day off per week, standardised wages, the right to have visitors, protection from dismissal without cause. The author, someone named Mrs. Emily Hobhouse, argues that domestic service as currently practiced is essentially slavery with better accommodations, that no amount of kindness from individual mistresses can compensate for a system built on exploitation. You fold the pamphlet carefully and hide it in your trunk, knowing that if Mrs. Giskid Henderson found it, you'd be dismissed for harbouring seditious materials. The late Victorian and Edwardian periods saw increasing agitation around what newspapers called the servant problem. Though reformers rightly pointed out that the problem wasn't servants but the conditions of service. Middle-class families complained they couldn't find good help, that servants were becoming demanding and unreliable, that young women increasingly refused service in favour of factory or shop work. They framed this as moral decay, a loss of proper deference, evidence that the lower classes were becoming uppity. What they actually witnessed was working-class women making rational economic calculations and choosing options that offered more freedom, better hours, and greater dignity. Even if the wages were similar or slightly lower, organisations began forming to advocate for servants' rights, though they struggled against enormous obstacles. The National Union of Domestic Workers, established in 1909, tried to organise servants into a collective force capable of demanding better conditions. But organising domestic workers presented unique challenges. They were scattered across thousands of individual households, rather than concentrated in factories. They lived where they worked and couldn't easily attend meetings, and they were often too exhausted or too fearful of dismissal to participate in activism. Additionally, many servants had internalised the ideology that their situation was natural or temporary, that organising was beneath them or unnecessary. You attend a meeting once, on one of your precious afternoons off, in a church hall that smells of dampened old hymnals. About 30 women crowd into the space, ranging from teenagers to women in their 50s, all still in their servant dress because they haven't time to change. A speaker addresses the group, a well-dressed lady who's clearly never been in service herself but speaks with passionate conviction about working women's dignity. She outlines the union's goals: a maximum 10-hour workday, 1 full day off weekly, protection from sexual harassment, standardised contracts, and the right to organise without retaliation. The women listen, and you watch their faces transform from scepticism to something like hope to crushing realism. One older cook speaks up, her voice sharp with experience. "That's lovely talk, miss, but how do we organise when we're scattered across London? How do we strike when we live in our employers' houses and have nowhere else to go? How do we demand rights when they can replace us tomorrow?" The speaker doesn't have good answers, just optimistic platitudes about solidarity and persistence. You leave the meeting feeling worse than when you arrived, your brief flicker of hope extinguished by the cook's harsh truths. Here's what made organising domestic workers nearly impossible: the personal nature of the employment relationship. In a factory, workers could see themselves as a collective force confronting an impersonal corporation. In service, you worked for Mrs. Henderson specifically, lived in her house, ate her food, depended on her personal goodwill. Organising felt like betraying someone you knew, even if that someone exploited you. The system's genius lay in creating thousands of individual relationships, rather than a single employment structure, fragmenting workers so completely that collective action seemed impossible. Some reformers approached the problem from different angles. Training schools opened, attempting to professionalise domestic service by teaching standardised skills and creating recognised qualifications. The theory was that if service became a respectable profession with clear standards, it would attract better workers and command better conditions. These schools taught everything from cooking techniques to proper silver service, from laundry methods to household accounting. Some servants benefited. gaining skills that increased their value and wages. But the schools couldn't fundamentally change the power imbalance inherent in the relationship, couldn't prevent dismissal without cause or guarantee decent working conditions. Historians still argue whether these reform movements improved conditions for actual servants or merely satisfied middle-class reformers' need to feel progressive while changing little in practice. Some evidence suggests that households did slowly improve conditions, offering more regular hours, slightly better wages, occasional full days off, in response to labour shortages and reform pressure. Other evidence suggests that actual change was minimal, that servants continued working brutal hours for inadequate compensation, that the improvements reached only a privileged few in urban areas, while servants in smaller towns and rural areas saw no benefits at all. Here's a quirky detail that reveals both the movement's aspirations and limitations. Some reformers proposed that servants should be called household workers or domestic assistants instead, believing that changing the terminology would change perceptions and improve status. The servants themselves often found this hilarious. Calling you a domestic assistant while you still scrubbed chamber pots at 5 in the morning changed exactly nothing. It was peak middle-class reform thinking. Focus on language and appearance while avoiding the structural changes that might actually matter. You didn't need a better title. You needed shorter hours, better wages, and basic human dignity. The most radical voices went further, questioning whether domestic service should exist at all. Some socialist writers argued that household labour should be collectivised. Communal kitchens, laundries, and childcare facilities that would free both servants and mistresses from the current system. These ideas terrified the middle class, who saw them as attacks on family privacy, femininity, and social order itself. The notion that Mrs. Henderson might do her own cooking or cleaning seemed to threaten civilization's very foundations. The fact that working-class women did their own housework while also working outside the home was conveniently ignored in these discussions. A few servants did rebel in individual ways, creating what historians call everyday resistance. You engage in it yourself, though you'd never use that grand term. You work slower when Mrs. Henderson isn't watching. You accidentally break items you find particularly tedious to maintain. You take slightly longer on errands, stealing 10 minutes to yourself in the market. You eat better food than you're entitled to, slipping bits from the pantry. You ignore rules that seem especially pointless. These aren't organised resistance or political acts, just survival strategies, ways of maintaining some tiny autonomy in a system designed to eliminate it entirely. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 would ultimately accomplish what reformers couldn't. It would break the domestic service system fundamentally and irreparably. But you don't know that yet. Standing in 1912 with your hidden pamphlet and your faint, foolish hope that things might somehow improve. You've heard rumours that some servants are leaving for new opportunities in offices and shops, that the desperate labour shortage is giving workers unprecedented leverage. Mrs. Henderson has become slightly less demanding lately, perhaps sensing that pushing too hard might send you looking elsewhere. One afternoon, you dare to mention to Mrs. Henderson that you'd like a full day off monthly instead of just an afternoon. You frame it carefully, apologetically, emphasising how it would help you attend to necessary personal business. She looks at you as if you've suggested something obscene, her face hardening into the expression you've learned to dread. You young women today have gotten such ideas, she says coldly. In my day, servants understood their position and were grateful for employment. One afternoon monthly is generous. Many households offer less. You apologise immediately, retreat into subservience. But internally something has shifted. You've asked, been denied, and survived. The world didn't end, and maybe you think in your most private thoughts. Maybe someday enough servants will ask simultaneously that employers will have no choice but to concede It's a fragile hope, easily crushed, but you hold it anyway, hidden like the pamphlet in your trunk, protected against the daily grind that tries to extinguish every spark of resistance. The year is 1915, and everything has changed so rapidly that you barely recognise the world or yourself. 2 years ago you were scrubbing Mrs. Henderson's floors for £14 annually. Now you're standing in a munition factory, wearing trousers and a work smock, operating machinery that produces artillery shells, earning 35 shillings per week, more money than you've ever imagined possessing. Your hands are stained yellow from the chemicals, your body aches from different labour than you knew before, and every day you risk explosion, poisoning, or mutilation. Yet when you receive your wages each Friday and count out actual folding money, substantial amounts that belong entirely to you, you feel something you've never experienced in service. The exhilarating, terrifying sensation of freedom. The Great War disrupted domestic service in ways that decades of reform movements couldn't accomplish. When Britain declared war in August 1914, young men enlisted or were conscripted by the millions, leaving behind jobs that needed filling. Simultaneously, the war effort demanded enormous production of munitions, uniforms, supplies, and equipment. Factories that had never employed women suddenly advertised for female workers, offering wages that made domestic service look like the exploitation it had always been. Within months, servants began leaving households in unprecedented numbers, abandoning mops and aprons for factory floors and bus conductor uniforms and postal delivery routes. You remember the day you told Mrs. Henderson you were leaving, how her face cycled through shock, anger, and something resembling desperation. She offered you more money, £16 annually. Then 18, but you were already calculating in your head. Factory work would give you nearly double that. Plus you'd live in your own lodgings, eat your own food, control your own time. She reminded you of her kindness, the training she'd provided, the references she could withhold. You apologised sincerely, genuinely not wanting to hurt her, but you'd already made up your mind. The old threats had lost their power. Factory work didn't require references from previous mistresses. The munitions factories needed workers desperately enough that they accepted anyone. Women with no industrial experience, women who'd never operated machinery, women who'd spent their lives in kitchens and sculleries and laundries. The training was minimal, just enough to prevent immediate death. You learned to fill shells with explosive powder, to seal them properly, to check for defects that might kill the soldiers who would eventually fire them. The work was dangerous in ways that domestic service never was. Explosions occurred regularly. Chemical poisoning slowly destroyed your body. Exhaustion led to accidents that mangled hands and arms. Yet most women who left service for war work didn't regret it. Despite the dangers, the difference wasn't just wages, though those mattered enormously. It was the structure of the work itself. The fundamental shift in your relationship to labour and employers. You clocked in at 7 and clocked out at 6, and between those hours you belonged to the factory. But outside them you belonged to yourself. You lived in a boarding house with other working women, eating meals together, talking freely, laughing loudly, going out in the evenings if you wanted. You wore what you chose on your days off. You received male visitors if you desired. You saved money for your own purposes. You were, for perhaps the first time in your adult life, autonomous. Historians still argue whether the war liberated women or simply transferred them from one form of exploitation to another, from domestic service to industrial wage labour, both exhausting, both underpaid compared to men's work. There's truth to both perspectives. The factory bosses exploited you, certainly, caring nothing for your health or safety, viewing you as temporary labour to be discarded when the war ended. But the nature of the exploitation differed crucially from service. You sold your labour to the factory, but not your entire life, not your personality, not your private time. The distinction felt profound. Here's what happened in households across Britain. Mistresses suddenly couldn't find servants at any price. Women who'd employed 3 or 4 maids found themselves down to 1, and that one was usually older, unable to secure factory work due to age or health limitations. Middle-class families who'd based their entire social identity on keeping servants suddenly had to do their own housework, and the humiliation cut deep. Newspapers published endless articles on the servant problem, with mistresses complaining about working women's ingratitude, lack of loyalty, and loss of proper respect. What they really mourned was the loss of cheap, controlled labour that made their comfortable lives possible. Mrs. Henderson wrote to you once, a letter that arrived at your boarding house, forwarded through complicated channels. She described her difficulties, doing her own cooking, her own cleaning, how exhausting she found it, how her hands had roughened from work. She seemed to expect sympathy, or perhaps to inspire guilt that would bring you back. You read the letter and felt nothing but amazement that she'd never understood what your life had been, never recognised that what exhausted her after a few months was what you'd endured for years while also managing on a fraction of her resources. You didn't reply. The war created other opportunities beyond factories. Women became bus conductors, tram drivers, postal workers, police officers, agricultural labourers, clerical workers in government offices. Each job offered something service hadn't. Defined hours, personal freedom, the ability to live independently. Some positions paid less than factory work, but women took them anyway because the freedom outweighed the wages. You could be a typist earning less than a cook earned, but you'd have evenings free, weekends off, a life outside employment. The calculation wasn't purely economic, it was existential. Here's a quirky detail that reveals how completely the war disrupted social norms. Women began wearing trousers in public, initially just for factory and agricultural work, but the taboo once broken proved impossible to restore completely. You wear trousers to the factory daily, and on your days off you sometimes wear them to the market, enjoying the shocked expressions of older people, the freedom of movement they provide. Mrs. Henderson would have dismissed you instantly for such immodesty. Now you wear what's practical and nobody can stop you. It's a small thing, but it feels revolutionary. This control over your own body and appearance. The work itself, though dangerous, offered something service never did: camaraderie. In the factory, you work alongside hundreds of other women, all doing similar tasks, all in similar circumstances. You develop friendships based on shared experience rather than hierarchy. During breaks, you sit together, share food, complain about supervisors, joke about the foreman's ridiculous moustache. There's no housekeeper insisting on silence, no rules about speaking only when spoken to, no artificial distinctions between upper and lower servants. You're all just workers, equal in your exhaustion and your yellow-stained hands. The government propaganda about women's war work emphasised patriotism and sacrifice. You were doing your bit for the boys at the front, supporting the nation, demonstrating British courage. Some of that resonated. You did feel pride contributing to the war effort, knowing the shells you made might help end the conflict faster. But honestly, most women you knew took war work for practical reasons: better money, more freedom, escape from domestic services' suffocating constraints. The patriotism was real but secondary to economic survival and personal autonomy. Do you remember the night the factory exploded, killing 16 women and injuring dozens more? The blast occurred 2 floors above where you were working, and you felt the building shake, heard the terrible sound, saw the smoke and flames. They evacuated everyone, and you stood outside in the cold darkness, watching fire crews fight the blaze, wondering which of your friends had died. The next day you were back at work because you needed the wages, stepping around the section that was roped off, trying not to think about bodies being removed, trying not to calculate the odds of your own death. Mrs. Henderson's kitchen had never threatened to explode, but then it had never paid you enough to live either. You accepted the danger as the price of freedom, and apparently that price was negotiable in ways dignity had never been. The armistice has been signed. The soldiers are returning, and you're standing in an employment office in 1919, staring at advertisements for domestic positions that look remarkably similar to the ones you fled 4 years ago. Experienced cook wanted, live-in, £40 annually. General maid required, good references essential. Ladies' maid sought for respectable household. The wages have increased slightly, responding to the labour shortage, but the fundamental structure remains unchanged. Long hours, live-in arrangements, complete submission to employer authority. You fold the newspaper carefully and walk out without applying for anything, because something inside you has broken that can never be repaired. You've tasted autonomy, and you cannot go back to servitude, regardless of what it costs you. The interwar years witnessed domestic services' slow, painful death. Though the system resisted its demise with remarkable tenacity, employers desperately wanted to return to pre-war normalcy, to restore the comfortable arrangements where servants made middle-class life possible. They advertised positions, offered improved wages, even occasionally conceded to reduced hours or better conditions. But they discovered that the women who'd left for war work weren't coming back, and young women entering the workforce increasingly refused service entirely. The number of domestic servants, which had peaked around 2 million in Britain before the war, began declining steadily and would continue dropping for decades. The women who did return to or remain in service found a changed landscape. Some households, unable to find full staffs, hired dailies, women who came in for specific hours to clean or cook but lived in their own homes and left when their work finished. This arrangement offered more freedom than live-in service, allowing women to maintain separate lives outside employment. The daily woman might work 3 or 4 different houses weekly, spreading her dependency across multiple employers, never fully controlled by any single household. It wasn't ideal work, but it was better than what you'd endured under Mrs. Henderson's constant surveillance. The stigma attached to service deepened during this period, becoming more pronounced than ever before. Domestic work was increasingly seen as degrading, something that only desperate women or recent immigrants accepted. Mothers advised daughters to take almost any other employment, factory work, shop work, even lower-paid clerical positions, rather than enter service. The reasoning was partly economic, but mostly social. Service marked you as subservient, as someone who'd sacrificed autonomy for security, as belonging to an inferior class. The war had shown that other options existed, and choosing service after experiencing alternatives seemed like accepting defeat. Here's what employers failed to understand. The problem wasn't that working-class women had become lazy or entitled or morally corrupted. The problem was that service had always been exploitative, and once alternatives existed, rational economic actors chose better options. A woman working in a shop might earn similar, or even slightly less than a live-in servant. But she controlled her own time, lived in her own space, and maintained her dignity. The calculation was obvious to everyone except employers, who continued framing the servant shortage as a character failing in modern women rather than a structural problem with service itself. Some households adapted by reducing their expectations and demands. Middle-class families that had employed 3 servants before the war now employed 1. And that one worked shorter hours with better conditions. Upper-class households that had maintained staffs of 20 found themselves managing with 8 or 10, cobbling together arrangements that mixed live-in servants, daily workers, and increasingly, mechanical appliances that reduced labour needs, vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and modern kitchen equipment began replacing human labour. Though slowly and unevenly, historians still argue whether technology replaced servants or whether the servant shortage drove technological adoption. Probably both occurred simultaneously in a feedback loop. Labour shortages made appliances more attractive, and appliances reduced the need for servants, which further decreased the servant population, which increased demand for more appliances. The homes being built in the 1920s and 1930s reflected this shift. Designed for families without servants, with smaller kitchens, no servants' quarters, no elaborate back stairways. The architectural changes made visible what was already becoming social reality. The Depression temporarily reversed some trends, as desperate poverty drove women back into service when no other work existed. But even during the 1930s, service never recovered its Victorian prominence. The women who entered service during the Depression did so reluctantly, left as soon as alternatives emerged, and made clear through their attitudes and demands that the old system was dead regardless of economic circumstances. They negotiated for days off, refused certain tasks, left positions if treated poorly, and generally behaved in ways that would have been unthinkable in Mrs. Henderson's day. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the cultural shift. Etiquette books from the 1920s and 1930s began advising mistresses to be friendly with servants, to say please and thank you, to treat them as human beings deserving respect. This would have been considered absurdly soft in Victorian times, but by the interwar period it was practical advice. If you wanted to retain servants at all, you had to treat them decently. The power dynamic hadn't equalised, but it had shifted enough that naked exploitation was no longer sustainable. Servants had options now, minimal though this might be, and options created leverage. You never returned to service, managing instead to find work as a typist, then a clerk, gradually building skills that kept you employed through the difficult interwar decades. You live in a small flat, share expenses with a friend from your factory days, and earn enough to survive, if not thrive. You're 35 now, unmarried and likely to remain so, which would have been shameful in your mother's generation but feels acceptable in yours. The war killed so many men that spinsterhood became statistically inevitable for your cohort, and you've discovered you don't actually want marriage if it means subordinating yourself to a husband the way you once subordinated yourself to employers. Sometimes you walk past houses where you once worked, grand places that seem smaller now, less intimidating than they appeared when you scrubbed their floors. You wonder about the women still inside, whether they are the last of their kind or whether service will somehow persist in new forms. You wonder about Mrs. Henderson, whether she ever learned to do her own housework competently, whether she thinks about you sometimes, whether she ever understood what she was participating in when she employed you. The bitter truth is that service survived, transformed but recognisable, continuing through these 20th century and new configurations. Cleaning services, au pairs, nannies, home health aides, different names for similar work, still primarily performed by women, still undervalued and underpaid, still involving care labour in private households where exploitation remains difficult to regulate or prevent. The Victorian system of elaborate household hierarchies disappeared. But the basic dynamic of employing vulnerable women to do domestic labour persisted. Finding new forms for new eras, you escaped, but others didn't. And the cycle continues in ways that would be depressingly familiar to any scullery maid from 1880, despite all the decades that have passed and all the supposed progress that's been made. You're watching a young woman named Maria change your mother's bedsheets in the nursing home, and something about the scene triggers memories so vivid they hurt. It's 1985. You're 73 years old. And Maria is perhaps 25. an immigrant from the Philippines who sends most of her wages home to family she hasn't seen in 3 years. She works 12-hour shifts caring for elderly patients, emptying bedpans, bathing bodies, offering comfort to people who often don't remember her name from one day to the next. She's efficient, gentle, and almost invisible. The nurses barely acknowledge her. The families thank her absently, if at all. You watch her hands, still young and smooth unlike your ancient gnarled ones, and you think nothing has changed. Not really. Not in the ways that matter most. The modern landscape of domestic and care work inherits directly from the hierarchies you once inhabited. Though the terminology and specific arrangements have evolved, live-in servants in grand houses have mostly disappeared, replaced by networks of specialised workers, housekeepers who come weekly, nannies who care for children, home health aides who tend the elderly and disabled, cleaners who maintain homes and offices. The work remains predominantly female, still undervalued, still poorly paid relative to its importance, still marked by power imbalances between employer and worker. Au pairs represent a particularly interesting continuation of the old system. Young women, usually from other countries who live with families, care for children and perform light housework in exchange for room, board, and small stipends. The arrangement is framed as cultural exchange rather than employment, which conveniently exempts it from many labour protections. Like the governesses of Victorian times, au pair occupy ambiguous social positions, not quite family members, not quite servants, floating in uncomfortable in-between spaces. They experience isolation, unclear boundaries, and vulnerability to exploitation that would be grimly familiar to Miss Hartley. The governess you once knew, the modern housekeeper, if employed by wealthy families, might earn decent wages and work defined hours, representing real improvement over Victorian service. But immigrant women cleaning multiple homes to survive, paid cash by the hour with no benefits or job security, experience conditions that differ only marginally from what you endured. They travel between houses, work invisibly, remain unprotected by regulations that cover other industries. If they are undocumented, they are even more vulnerable, unable to report abuse or wage theft, subject to deportation threats if they complain, trapped in power dynamics that make Victorian service look almost progressive by comparison. Here's what strikes you most forcefully about Maria and women like her. They perform essential care work that society depends upon but refuses to value properly. Caring for your mother requires skill, patience, physical strength, and emotional intelligence. Yet Maria earns barely above minimum wage with no benefits and no job security. The work is dismissed as unskilled despite requiring competencies most people don't possess. It's gendered as women's work, which automatically devalues it, and it's performed largely by women of colour or immigrants, which adds racial and national hierarchies to the gender and class hierarchies that always structured domestic labour. The professionalisation of some domestic work created improvements for some workers. Unionised home health aides, licensed childcare providers, professional house managers earn better wages and have more protections than Victorian servants dreamed of. But professionalisation also created new hierarchies, new ways of distinguishing respectable care work from mere domestic labour. A registered nurse caring for your mother in a hospital has status and decent pay. Maria, doing essentially similar work in the nursing home, earns a fraction of that and receives a fraction of the respect. Historians still argue whether domestic work can ever be truly equitable while it remains primarily privatised, purchased by individual families rather than provided through collective social arrangements. Some countries experiment with socialised childcare, elder care and housekeeping services that remove these functions from market relationships and individual employment. But in most capitalist societies, caring labour remains something wealthier families purchase from poorer women, reproducing across generations the fundamental dynamic of inequality that structured Victorian households. Technology changed some aspects of housework dramatically. Washing machines, dishwashers, vacuum cleaners, microwave ovens reduced the pure physical labour required for household maintenance. But technology didn't eliminate the need for human care work. Children still need tending. Elderly people still require assistance. Homes still demand cleaning and organising. The work shifted but didn't disappear, and someone still has to do it. Usually that someone is a woman, often an immigrant woman or woman of colour, earning wages that don't reflect the work's actual value or difficulty. Here's a quirky detail about modern domestic work. Families hiring nannies or housekeepers often struggle with the same psychological complexities that troubled Victorian mistresses and servants. How friendly should you be with someone who cleans your toilet but whom you want to trust with your children? What boundaries should exist between employer and employee when the employee works in your most private spaces? Modern parenting forums overflow with anxious discussions about these questions, revealing that the fundamental weirdness of the employment relationship hasn't resolved despite all the social changes. You're still creating intimacy within hierarchy, still expecting someone to care about your family while maintaining that they're not part of your family. The global care chain represents perhaps the most striking modern parallel to Victorian service. Women from poor countries migrating to wealthy countries to perform care work, leaving their own children behind to be raised by other women, sending money home to support families they rarely see. Maria has 2 children in Manila being raised by her mother. She sees them perhaps once every 2 years when she can afford the flight home. This arrangement extracts care labour from poor communities to service wealthy ones, reproducing internationally the class dynamics that once operated within individual nations. You try to talk with Maria sometimes, asking about her life, her family, treating her like a person rather than a function. She's polite but guarded, maintaining professional distance that you recognise from your own servant days, the protective shell you develop to survive constant scrutiny and judgment. You want to tell her that you understand, that you once scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots, that you know what it feels like to be invisible. But you don't, because you're not sure she'd believe you. And anyway, what would be the point? Your understanding doesn't improve her wages or working conditions. Sympathy without structural change is just another form of condescension. The nursing home employs dozens of women like Maria, mostly immigrants from the Philippines, Honduras, Haiti, and West Africa. They form their own communities, sharing apartments to afford rent, speaking their home languages during breaks, supporting each other through the grinding difficulty of care work. You watch them and see echoes of the servants' hall where you once ate your meals, the same camaraderie born of shared exploitation, the same hierarchies reproducing within the worker community itself. The registered nurses, mostly white, occupy positions similar to Victorian housekeepers, supervising the care aides who do the hardest physical labour for the lowest pay. Sometimes Maria's supervisor, a white nurse named Jennifer, speaks to her in that particular tone you remember so well from Mrs. Henderson, mixing condescension with impatience, treating Maria like she's slightly stupid or lazy despite Maria's obvious competence. You intervene once, saying sharply, "Maria knows what she's doing. She's been caring for my mother excellently." Jennifer looks startled that you've noticed, that you have opinions about staff interactions. The hierarchies persist not just in employment relationships, but in who gets to be visible, whose competence gets acknowledged, whose humanity gets recognised. You think about the long arc from your scullery days to this nursing home room, all the decades between, all the changes and all the continuities. The elaborate Victorian household with its dozens of specialised servants has vanished. But the fundamental dynamic, women purchasing other women's labour to free themselves from domestic and care work, persists. The women at the bottom are still predominantly poor, still predominantly immigrants or people of colour, still undervalued and underpaid. The women benefiting from their labour have changed. Professionals now, working outside the home themselves, but still needing someone to do the work they can't or won't do. The system adapted, transformed, survived. You're sitting by the window in the nursing home, the afternoon light soft across your lap, and you're thinking about all the women whose names you never knew, the scullery maid who worked before you, and whose existence you learned about only through a single mention in the housekeeper's records, the tweenie who disappeared one night and was never spoken of again, the kitchen maid who died of typhoid at 19 and was buried in the pauper's grave. These women built the world you inhabited, scrubbed the floors of history, and left almost no trace beyond the work of their hands. Their labour made possible the comfortable lives of families whose names fill history books, whose portraits hang in museums, whose letters and diaries scholars study. But the women who emptied their chamber pots, who raised their children, who prepared their meals, these women vanished like morning mist. The historian in the corner of your mind, the part of you that remained curious despite exhaustion, wonders how this story should be told. For so long, domestic service was invisible in historical accounts, mentioned only in passing if at all, considered too mundane for serious attention. The grand narratives focused on politicians and industrialists, wars and inventions, treating households as background rather than as sites where actual human lives unfolded. Yet domestic service employed more women than any other occupation for over a century, shaped millions of lives, structured the intimate daily existence of both servants and employers. How can you understand Victorian or Edwardian society without understanding the labour that made it function? The women who worked in service were not passive victims, though the system oppressed them terribly. You remember the small rebellions, the stolen moments, the ways servants carved out tiny spaces of autonomy within total control. You remember the cook who deliberately ruined dishes for employers she disliked, the housemaid who shared gossip about the family with neighbouring servants, spreading their secrets as revenge for her own powerlessness. You remember your own small acts of resistance, working slowly when unobserved, taking extra food, claiming to misunderstand instructions you understood perfectly. These weren't political acts, weren't organised resistance, but they were refusals nonetheless. Small ways of insisting you remained human despite systems designed to reduce you to functions. The relationships between women in these households, servants with mistresses, were more complex than simple exploitation or simple solidarity. You remember genuine kindness from some women above you in the hierarchy, genuine cruelty from others who shared your class position. You remember Mrs. Henderson's occasional warmth mixed with her consistent exploitation, Miss Caroline's loneliness despite her elevated position, the cook's harshness born from her own survival struggles. These were women navigating systems that constrained all of them differently, and their responses ranged across the full spectrum of human behaviour. Reducing them to victims or villains misses the complicated reality of how power operates in intimate spaces. The legacy of service persists in ways both obvious and subtle. The physical infrastructure remains, grand houses with servants' quarters now converted to storage, back staircases that once separated social classes now used for convenience, bells that no longer ring. The psychological infrastructure persists too, in attitudes about whose work deserves recognition, whose labour is valued, whose humanity is acknowledged. When modern society dismisses care work as unskilled, when it pays cleaners poverty wages, when it expects women to manage both careers and households, while men are praised for minimal domestic participation. It's continuing Victorian assumptions about women's work and women's worth. Here's what you wish you could tell young women now. Your labour has always mattered, regardless of whether history recorded it. The meals you prepared sustained bodies that built empires. The children you raised became the politicians and industrialists whose names fill textbooks. The homes you maintained provided the stable base from which others launched ambitious ventures. Your work was never insignificant. Though it was treated that way, you were never invisible, though you were made to feel invisible. The world depended on you completely while pretending you barely existed. And that contradiction reveals everything about how power operates and whom it serves. Historians still argue whether domestic service should be understood primarily through the lens of class exploitation, gender oppression, or both simultaneously intertwined. The answer, you think from the perspective of someone who lived it, is obviously both, inseparably. You were exploited as a worker and as a woman, and the two couldn't be disentangled. Your gender made you suitable for this particular exploitation, and the exploitation reinforced beliefs about gender that extended far beyond individual households. The system trapped everyone within it, though obviously not equally. Misses. Henderson was constrained by expectations about ladylike behaviour, but you were constrained by those expectations, plus economic desperation, plus lack of alternatives. The differences in degree were so vast they became differences in kind. The story of household hierarchies for women is ultimately a story about power. Who has it? Who lacks it? How it's maintained? How it's sometimes challenged? It's about the ways societies organise essential labour. Who performs that labour? And how performers are valued or devalued. It's about intimacy and alienation existing simultaneously. About care work performed without caring. About service relationships that were deeply personal and fundamentally exploitative. It's about women employing women, the contradictions of that relationship, the potential solidarities that were suppressed, and the genuine antagonisms that emerged. It's about survival and resistance, about dignity maintained against systems designed to crush it, about humanity persisting in dehumanizing circumstances. You think about all the words you might use to describe your years in service: exhausting, degrading, lonely, occasionally funny, sometimes tender in unexpected moments, always constrained by invisible walls. You think about the girl you were at 14, arriving at your first position with nothing but your labour to sell. You think about the woman you became, shaped by those experiences but never entirely defined by them, carrying forward both wounds and unexpected strengths. Service took things from you: years of youth, opportunities for education, possibilities for different lives. But it also gave you things, though you'd have preferred to acquire them differently: resilience, competence, understanding of how systems work and whom they serve. The afternoon light shifts, marking time's passage as it always does, indifferent to human stories. Soon Maria will arrive to help with dinner, moving through her tasks with practiced efficiency, visible to you now in ways you weren't visible to your employers. You make a point of thanking her, always, and meaning it. Though you know thanks don't pay rent or change systems, you tried to treat her with the dignity you wish someone had shown you. Though you also know that individual kindness within exploitative structures can be its own form of violence, making people grateful for the mere absence of cruelty rather than demanding actual justice. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for: why certain families lived in such comfort, where that comfort came from, whose labour created and maintained it. The mystery was never really mysterious. It was hidden deliberately, kept invisible because acknowledging it would require acknowledging injustice, would require changing systems that benefited those with power to maintain them. You were told your work was service, as if service were inherently noble, as if sacrifice were inherently meaningful. But service is only noble when chosen freely and compensated fairly, when it's reciprocal rather than extracted. What you experienced was often just exploitation wearing the costume of duty. Now the light fades further, and you feel the weight of years in your bones, different from the exhaustion of youth but related to it. Part of the same long story of bodies used by labour, aged by work, You survived your time in service, escaped it eventually, built something resembling a life afterward. Others weren't as fortunate, and their stories ended in workhouses, hospitals, paupers' graves. You remember them too, these vanished women, and in remembering, you offer them the only immortality available, being held briefly in someone's mind, acknowledged as having mattered, recognized as fully human despite everything that tried to make them less. And so you sit in the gathering dusk, an old woman holding memories of a world that has mostly disappeared, of a girl who once was you, scrubbing pots in icy water at dawn. The story stretches behind you, long and complicated, winding through decades and across social transformations, touching millions of lives that have faded into silence. You think about the women who came before you, the women who came after, the women working still in variations on the same ancient theme of some caring for others, being paid too little, being valued too little, making possible the lives that others call their own. The house grows quiet around you, that particular late afternoon hush when the world pauses between day and evening, between what was and what will be. You close your eyes and you're 19 again, standing in a garden at dusk, William's hand touching yours briefly, your heart full of impossible hopes and realistic fears. You're 25, walking away from your last domestic position forever, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. You're 30, 40, 50, carrying forward through the years everything those early experiences taught you about survival, dignity, resistance, and grace under impossible circumstances. And now you're here, at the end of the story, and the light is very soft, and you're very tired, and maybe you can rest now, knowing that the story has been told, that the women have been remembered, that their labour and their lives have been acknowledged. The hierarchies that once seemed eternal have crumbled or transformed, and while new hierarchies have emerged, at least the old ones are visible now, named, understood as what they always were, systems of power and exploitation wearing disguises of tradition and propriety. Sleep comes easily these days, slides over you like a familiar blanket, and in sleep, sometimes you dream of clean water, of hands unmarked by labour, of mornings when you wake because you've rested enough rather than because someone demands your presence. In sleep, you're free in ways you rarely were in waking life. And perhaps that's gift enough? Compensation of a sort. These dreams where you're finally, fully, completely yourself, unbounded by service, unlimited by hierarchy, simply human in the uncomplicated way you always deserve to be.